Hi, welcome to Module 3. We're talking about inquiry process, the lesson explanation, and inquiry characteristics during this module. Once again, I always encourage you to have everything in the module printed out and have all the examples printed out. That way you have everything in front of you so you can kind of go through this step by step. We'll also talk about this on the video itself. Today we'll be talking about inquiry and why do we use it. Well, inquiry actually has been around for decades. Actually, John Dewey came up with the idea and used inquiry more often in the classroom than anybody else. But it's basically explaining and exploring information by questioning and also examination of results of knowledge. And what we're trying to do with inquiry is make the students go to a different level and let them investigate what's going on. A lot of times we use inquiry in the classroom, we just don't call it inquiry. Teaching should teach students to cope with various forms of knowledge found in society by equipping students to discover new knowledge. And that's what we're trying to do. When you're doing an inquiry lesson, you're trying to implement inquiry into the classroom. Think about trying to get students to come up with new knowledge on their own, instead of you necessarily giving it to them. We're trying to switch gears here, incorporate that knowledge into their lives. How would something apply to them? How is it applicable to their daily lives? While doing so, we're asking them to formulate responses and answers. And that's what's important here versus what we've done in the past. In the past, we've always told the students what they need to know, had told them the correct answer. While here at inquiry, we're asking them to come up with answers, come up with responses and objectives to the inquiry, and more importantly, how did they get to the process? How did we come up from A to D? What was in between to get to those points? And that's what we're trying to get the students to do here, is to come up with the objective of the inquiry is basically the process. How are they coming to this point? And one thing that we have to do in inquiry lessons, after you've used the classroom, you've already lectured, you've had to use strict instruction or had them do readings, things like that. The point is that when you use an inquiry lesson, remember you're a supportive role. You're not actually lecturing to them, you're allowing them to dig deep down and find out what's going on in the information. So that is what inquiry is about. Now what's interesting is that as you look at the history of the social studies education, inquiry was a very positive thing until the 1960s, and then we changed it to problem solving because inquiry wasn't a politically correct term during the 1960s and 70s. So we used the word problem solving, which is the exact same thing. We're going through the process of them coming up with their own objectives and how they got to those objectives. So inquiry or problem solving is the exact same thing. 5 important characteristics when we talk about inquiry approach that you always should understand as a teacher when you're doing this. The focus is on the student, it's not on you. You're not always up there, always about you. This time it's going to be on the student. The pace of instruction is flexible and not fixed. Now what I mean by that is I know you have a certain amount of time in the classroom you have to use, 50 minutes, maybe some people have block scheduling, but it's flexible in terms of how they're going through the steps. You can't necessarily say this is going to take exactly 2 minutes, this is going to exactly take 5 minutes, because it is flexible. As they go through the process of learning the information and gathering the information, it might take one group 5 minutes, the next group 10 minutes. So in terms of planning for this, it's sometimes you kind of got to guesstimate once again. Students search for the implications. The students are doing the work, not you. Letting the group or letting them individually work on it through implications, letting them find out what's going on. Students are encouraged to find multiple solutions. And this is what we're trying to do, because if you want to get a student ready for society, not necessarily the content exam, or both, sometimes you've got to get them to think beyond the test. And here we're asking them to encourage them to find multiple solutions. What are other ways we can solve this problem? And students must justify their responses. And this is very important here in terms of justification, because a lot of times students will just give an answer and that's it, and not expect to defend that answer. And I'm not saying you go and pick on every student in the classroom, but you want to try to encourage them to justify why they're coming up with these solutions. I mean, that's what we do in real life, that's what we do in the real world, so we're trying to replicate that here in the classroom. The most common forms of inquiry, we have really 3 out there, we call it the big 3. Inductive, we have a small focus on a topic to a large focus. Okay, so inductive inquiry, we're talking about something very small, minute, and then we're expanding that into a larger societal focus. So something very small going very large. For example, and this is very timely, but we're talking about race relations. If an incident takes place in a city or town, you use inquiry, you're focusing on the actual event that took place in that town, but you also have to expand it to what about society. Here on deductive, you go from a large focus to a topic to a smaller focus. So you look at a large race relations or large drug policies or immigration policies with our country, and it goes down to a very minute situation that took place in a town. So these two are literally flip-flopping one another. If you want to go from a very small focus on immigration to the large immigration policy of our country, use inquiry. If you want to use deductive inquiry, you're going from very large incidents that happens down to something that took place in a town dealing with immigration. So it depends on which way you think is the best way for the students to learn. We'll talk about that in a second. Then you have reflective inquiry, where the students are forming a hypothesis, gathering data and sources to defend their decision. This is kind of more of your hard sciences. More of your sciences will look at a hypothesis, this I think is going to take place, and then we're actually going to investigate it, and this is what happens at the end. So really, these are the two most popular. This one tends to be more of your hard sciences, probably more of your biology, your sciences, while these tend to be more social studies based. Now, the Big Six models. And this is what I always tell my students. They always say, well, Dr. Byford, what model should I use? You have to get in your head what you're going to teach first. Think about in your head, okay, this is what I have to teach. What best way would it work in the classroom? And I always tell students to shop around. Look at these 6 different models as we talk about them and say, you know what, as I teach this, I think my students are more inclined to this kind of model versus this model. You don't always want to have that square peg or that peg trying to shove through that round hole. You've got to find the one that best represents you. So you look through these first and say, as I write my lessons, which one of these is the best fit for me or my students? Model number 1 is inquiry, and it's inductive. Now, this is what I always tell people. These are the steps for model number 1. The question is raised and stated clearly. A tentative answer is developed by the students. Evidence bearing on the tentative answer is gathered, so the students are gathering information. A conclusion is drawn from the evidence. So the students are now taking evidence they found in number 3, and they're applying it and coming with a conclusion. And number 5, conclusion is applied to the original question. So they take what they found and they apply it towards number 1. So they're going full circle. They started with a question. They come with a rough idea what they think the question and answer is going to be. They take evidence based on it. They look at the evidence. They come with a conclusion. And then they apply it back to number 1, saying, okay, based on what we found, did it meet what we came up with number 1? These 5 steps are authentic and for model number 1. If you like model number 2, which is also inductive, it's a little bit different. A question is raised. Evidence is sought and evaluated. It's a different step from step number 2 up here. It's a little different spin. A proposition or general rule is inferred from the particular evidence being gathered. So they kind of come up with a general rule of what they found. A question is tested against the proposition or rule. In future situations, the proposition or rules is tested against a new evidence. This one is usually not used as much as number 1. I don't know if it's because students see number 1 and say, hey, it's the first one there, I like it. But this is probably one of the most popular ones out there. But if you say you're doing a module number 2, and you put it in the lesson plan, and you start using different steps over here, you're going to get dinged for it big time on your evaluations. Because you stick with the steps. Those steps are designed for module 1, model number 2, and then you have model 3 and 4, and so forth. Model number 3 is deductive, so we're going to go from a different standpoint. Remember, we're flipping the way this is done. The question is raised, a known general rule is stated, the answer is inferred from the general rule, evidence is accuracy is sought, and evidence is used to confirm the answer and general rule. So if you just follow these steps, these will work in different ways. Like I said, as you go through and you say, I don't know which one of these to use, I'm confused, go through and think about what you're going to be teaching, and then think in your head, as I teach this lesson, what do I want the students to do? 90% of the time, students default to model number 1. I'm not saying it's right or wrong. I'm not endorsing one or the other, but that tends to be the number 1 model used for inquiry. Then you have the story model. This is also very important if you're talking about having the students look at historical stuff, raising a question, researching the source, interpreting the evidence, and presenting the findings. This is also a very popular one used among the students. Then you have the last 2, the problem solving, and then you also have survey research, which is inductive. And like I said before, follow these steps, keep these steps solely for each model, and you'll be okay. The problem students get into is they say, I like this one, I like these 2, and I think I really like these 2 up here, and they come up with their own inquiry model. Don't do that, because you'll get dinged. Pick one and stick with these steps, and we're going to show you how these steps look in just a second. So let's look at the lesson plan. I always like to try to make it applicable, something there that's there for you. As you get ready to teach this lesson plan, remember, a lesson plan is designed for you, it's designed for your administration, it's designed to be put on file. A lesson plan is like a script. Look at a lesson plan and think of a lesson plan as constantly changing. Your first period class, this lesson might be taught a little bit different from your third period class because the classes are different. So a good lesson plan, in my opinion, always has been worked on. So as you go into the classroom, you have your state standards and objectives on the board, you have your daily agenda on the board, and you're going through this, and you've talked about stuff. You notice here that your unit chapter objectives, I've left this blank because as you go through your textbook, it'll tell you what those objectives are. The lesson objectives, which are measurable, are identifying and listing, construct, compare and contrast. These are all different levels of blooms. If you go back to that bloom chart that I have, that I've given you, and I believe in module 1 or 2, you're going to notice that these are all measurable objectives. Here you have non-measurable objectives, which are goals. Students will appreciate the advances of farming and technology, and students will become familiar with various forms. You can't measure students becoming familiar with something. You can't measure a student appreciating something because the way I appreciate something, the way you appreciate something might be completely different. I might appreciate it by buying the CD of some kind of music while you might simply just listen to it or write something down. So appreciation is not unmeasurable, but you've got to have goals. Goals versus measurable objectives. So in this particular case, like we talked about before, I'm talking about the agrarian movement. I'm talking about my 9th grade class. When I was talking about world history when I taught, we're talking about agrarian versus nomadic. Okay, where these people are now going to stay in one particular place and choose to do have their food on the ground in one plot versus constantly moving around. The state standards, I use state world history standards here, which you can get from the different links that I've given you. And the national standards, 1.5 individual groups and institutions. So I'm using state and national. Okay, you also want to encourage you to use Common Core because you're going to be using Common Core next semester anyway, so you might as well go ahead and get used to that. The materials. And you notice it here, I'm very descriptive on my materials, and you'll be doing the same thing in your lesson plans. Materials required for this lesson plan include a variety of materials. I go through it step by step. Students will receive notes via Polythium board, if you have that, if not, overhead transparencies. As students gather in small groups, which I'm putting in those small groups, each group is presented with the following: a small orange, one small bag with the following information, the following stuff: a tape, a plastic fork, toothpicks, 3 popsicle sticks, and 2 paper clips. You think, my gosh, I need MacGyver. What are they going to do with this stuff? What we're trying to do is to get the students to realize that taking that orange, you've got to peel that orange without your fingers. So you've got to have the students come up with a way of making a tool to peel the orange. Now, it sounds as stupid as all get out, but let me explain something. They actually like doing this. To them, it's a competition. If you can create a family competition in the classroom and have a little award ceremony or a little presentation at the very end of the class and have the class pick the best tool, it's amazing what takes place. They actually get into this because they actually are going to do hands-on learning for our tactile kinesthetic learners. So you're having them take the orange and peel it. The same principle applies to them making a plow or a hoe or something like that to use in the land. This inquiry lesson was designed to address issues associated with basic farming techniques. The background rationale is very detailed. My academic terms and language, if you look on the same copy that I've given you, I have words that might come up that they might not understand, or words that are important words, such as functionality, capability, efficiency, ergonomics, and inductive inquiry. These are words that you're going to be using in the lesson that are going to come up that they might not know, but you want to identify as being words that are very important in terms of the lesson itself. Also here, this activity is the second lesson within the unit. This is important as you start thinking about putting your unit together. No matter if you use inquiry or whatever kind of lessons are we talking about this semester, start trying to stack them and make your life easy by trying to get the lessons now instead of trying to, towards the end of the semester, trying to frantically come up with 5 different lessons. So this is the second lesson within the unit. Before the lesson, the teacher and the class had discussed and analyzed the need for characteristics of early farming. So I'm setting the stage of where this falls into the big picture and what we've talked about before we did this lesson. You just want to do cold turkey and drop this lesson on and say, hey, ladies and gentlemen, we're going to talk about farming techniques. Here's an orange, and here's some tools to play with. That doesn't work. You've got to have it where there's something to build upon. This lesson is important because it illustrates the difficulties associated with farming. You talk about what the lesson is, where it falls in, what we've done in the past, how it's important. In addition, this lesson acts as a springboard onto the third lesson, and how it's going to also springboard into the third lesson. So we talked about where it stands, what we talked about before we got to this lesson, and how it's going to springboard into the third lesson. So you're giving me a rich detail here of what we want. Remember, on the lesson plan we're using in this class, you've got to do this. Back before we started doing this type, you could just do bullet points. You can't do that anymore, especially when it comes to your student teaching next semester, or when you're doing your student internships and things like that. You're going to have to start using more detail for your schools and also for us at the university. Procedures, okay? Introduction. How are you going to introduce this to the class? Okay, we're going to put them in different groups, 3 or 4 students. Once the groups are placed, ask the students how many of them have ever grown their own food, or worked on a farm, or held a family garden. Was it easy or difficult? So you're starting the classroom introduction by talking to them, like, how many of you have done this? How many of you have done this? And get a little conversation going. Some will raise their hands, some will raise their hands, and ask them how difficult it was. Did you have fun doing it? What were some things that really were bad? What are some things that worked really well for you? And you're going to start that introduction. Now, I'm guesstimating that it takes around 7 minutes. Okay? It might take 5 minutes. It might take 3 minutes. If you have a class that's very talkative, it might take 7 or 8, 9 minutes. You kind of got to fluctuate your times. These are simply guesstimates. Now, notice what I'm using here. Under procedure, I'm using inquiry model number 1. So I go back to that sheet that I gave you, that you have in your module. You look at model number 1, and you're going to notice those steps that I had in there. The first step was, which is the exact same step here, is a question is raised and stated clearly. I guesstimate this is around 5 minutes to do that. Ask each small group to think about and reflect on the following written questions. What makes something a tool? So you can write that on the board, you can give them a piece of paper. What are the criteria to call something a tool? When I call something a tool, what makes it a tool? It sounds like a stupid question, but if you really start thinking about that, are there characteristics that define what makes something a tool? Okay? What makes something useful? Now remember, that is up to subjection. That's up to students and what they believe is useful and what's not useful. And based on the previous lesson, excuse me, how did humans better themselves with tools? Because remember, this is the second lesson and the first lesson we've already talked about, forming techniques, etc., etc. Can your group build a better tool? So you set the stage. The question is raised and stated clearly. Here's questions that I've raised. Okay? Now, let's try to find the answer to this. A tentative answer is developed. 7 minutes. Each group then brainstorms of 3 inventions that is vital to their lives. Now, this could be technology, this could be anything. And I've seen the gamut between computers, iPads, whatever it is. These students, they find these 3 inventions as being very important in their lives. Have each group justify why they need these 3 items. Students feel like they don't have their cell phone, you cut their fingers off. And I guarantee a cell phone will be up there with it because they have to, it's like permanently attached to their face. Are the items necessary or a luxury? And that's what's interesting. What is actually luxury and what is actually necessities? And that's where you get into the gray area with students and their phones. They think that a phone is a necessity when in reality it's a luxury. What are some reasons early farm tools? What are some of the early farm tool characteristics? And so you're trying to build upon your first question up here. So we talked about the question is raised, tentative answer is developed. What in terms of 3 things they think is important and vital to their lives? Are they luxuries? Are they necessities? What is it? And so we've gone to there. The third step, evidence bearing the tentative answer is gathered in approximately 10 minutes. Tell the class that like early farmers, tools were needed to design and improve farming efficiency. What they have to do now is you give them the bag and you give them the orange, and now they have to come up with a tool that can peel the orange. And this is interesting. You're going to see between stuff that looks like absolute crud, the things that look like really, really, really interesting, and cool, and you say, hey, that might actually work. So you're going to give them time to actually do it. Here, conclusion is drawn from the evidence. 5 minutes, have each group select a representative. They then take it up to the class, show the orange, and show how they would peel. Some will break, some won't break. You don't have them up here actually peel the orange. This is where you're testing. So they're designing up here, and they're testing right here, and then the conclusion is applied to the original question. And as a class vote on the best orange peeler, ask students that they believe, given time, they can develop the perfect peeler. And I think that the old saying is, can you build a better mousetrap? We've been trying to build better mousetraps for years and years and years, and you get very different versions of mousetraps. But in reality, a mousetrap's a mousetrap. It does its job efficiently, and that's what it's designed to do. So you've done all the steps. You'll notice each one of these steps is a step in model number 1 for inquiry model number 1. So the assessment phase. This lesson was formative or it was informal. When I say formative, it means it was a daily grade. It's not summative, summarizing what they've done for the entire unit. Students were evaluated in small groups, and they were evaluated on a product, completion of the orange peeler. I evaluated them on presentation, which is informal because they did a class presentation, and also a demonstration. No homework was given. It's very important you have that information up there. I need to know how they were evaluated. You say it was a formative grade, and you say no homework was given. I don't know, did you just throw out A's and B's and C's, or how did you do it? So I need to know what you're doing up there. And then you notice something. This lesson dealt with early humans moving from hunter-gatherer society into a permanent agrarian society. Students were asked to, oh my gosh, call me crazy, but these are your 3 measurable objectives at the very beginning of your lesson. You're going to take those 3 measurable objectives and you're going to put them right back here. Why do we do this? You're summarizing again for me what you've done. Okay? Students were tasked, and you're telling me what they were doing to help the process of agricultural tools. The goal of this lesson was to encourage students to use creativity while experiencing some of the same frustrations of early farmers. So in sum, what we've done is you're telling me how you're assessing them, you're telling me what they did, you're telling me in a summary what happened. Now, in terms of modifications, for my students who are auditory learners, the students who like to listen, they can have their heads down on their desk, not that I'm saying that's okay, and they can just listen to what you're saying. You had group and class discussions of the designs, rationale, and mechanics of orange peelers. So this is for the students that like to listen and do group discussions. My tactile kinesthetic learners, in groups, they did hands-on. They designed their own orange peels. And so they did it from that standpoint. They're moving around, demonstration to the class. We're trying to hit different levels of learning. You always got to make sure you try to hit this within your classes. My visual learners, pictures of various tools used in the past. Probably going to be more of your lesson 1 and summary of lesson 1 when you talk about lesson 2. But visual learners, having the presentations, etc., etc. Now, diversity and multicultural learners, based on classroom demographics, students might ask if other cultures or communities use different tools in agriculture. And that's so true. We're talking about Hispanic students who have relatives that may have lived in Mexico. They might do completely different from us. People who live in different parts of Asia, Europe, different ways of farming techniques. It might be interesting to see if other cultures do other things. It doesn't mean you pick on one particular student. You might just say, based on what we see around the world, could other cultures do things differently? And that's so true. How we do farming techniques in this region of the country is completely different from other parts of the country. So it depends on where you live and what you're doing. And then finally, you have your lower and higher level students. Your lower level students, peer reinforcement in the groups, helping other students along, okay, peer tutoring. And then higher level students ask students to compare third world countries to first and modern world countries. I myself have been to third world and second world countries, and it's very different from us. I went to Vietnam and did work in Vietnam, and they are a solid second world country, and they do not have the same kind of agricultural techniques that we do. However, it works for them. The way they plant rice and work rice in the fields is completely different from us. We use airplanes to seed rice sometimes. They use hands. And the end product's the same. It's rice. So it's interesting to see how different countries do different things in terms of agriculture and how they do it. And then also here, we always will say, is all modifications will meet according to the student's IEP. If you try to put every student's accommodations down here, number one, you've broken FERPA by having, if this lesson ever gets out to anybody else, all the other teachers or other students will see this and know every other student's modifications or needs. So you simply just put this, all modifications will meet according to the student's IEP program of study. And then it's up to you as an individual to make those modifications on a case-by-case basis. So what we've done in this PowerPoint, in this actual video, is we've talked about the inquiry lesson. We talked about the 6 different types of inquiry models that are out there. I encourage you to look at it, find the one that best fits you. 90% of the time it's probably model number 1 for inquiry, that's fine. And you do not go away from the steps for each one of those modules, each one of those models. And you'll notice as we go through here, like I said before, these are all different steps. So as you go through here and you look at this, you look at the stuff in your actual module itself, Module 3, if you have questions, email me and let me know what's going on, because it's not as difficult as it seems. It's just practice, practice, practice. When this lesson is due, your inquiry lesson is due, if you get it to me ahead of time, I'll be more than happy to look at it and tell you what you did right or wrong, and we'll go from there. But like I said, if you have any questions, please email me at the class email, or email me at jmbyford@memphis.edu. Until then, I'll see you at the next module.